Welcome back to Directly Current with me, Max Patton, where I'm covering the politics of EVs in the lead up to a wild US presidential election cycle. Few things animate the charged political rhetoric that's thrown about with electric cars like the mere mention of China. EVs and
China
have become intertwined, mostly because China has developed an unassailable lead in making the most important and most expensive component of any electric car: battery cells, which form modules that form a car's battery pack. Without a good battery pack, an electric car is going to have poor range, poor charging, and just not be a good vehicle in general. EV batteries from China aren't just a political target, however, of Donald Trump, who led the charge on an all-out trade war in his first term in office. The current Biden administration is imposing a 25% tariff on any vehicle coming into the US with a Chinese battery, and it's unlikely a Harris successor White House would change any of that. Either way, the best batteries are being made in China, and it's an all-out race between the United States and our allies like South Korea to compete with
China
while stalling the damage from their undeniable lead. Today, I have the honor of speaking with The Information's Steve LeVine, who runs their reporting on the battery arms race and EVs at large in a newsletter that's aptly branded The Electric. Steve is a career journalist who's covered international affairs in countries like Russia and Kazakhstan. He's covered the market for oil in the wake of the Soviet Union collapsing, and most recently, he's covering the new economy and arms race with batteries. He even wrote a book about it we'll link in this episode. The story of EV batteries is also the story of the world's greatest superpowers duking it out. So let's get up to speed with Steve LeVine. Welcome to Directly Current, Steve.
Thanks, Max.
You've been a career journalist. You've covered foreign affairs. You've been in the Caucasus. You covered oil and energy markets. And for the last few years, you published a book and now you're writing for The Information. You've covered the battery story playing out, especially between the US and China. Can you help explain that pivot? What made you decide to be interested in that area?
Yeah, that's not a direct route, not one that I've seen a lot of other people take, but it does make sense if you think of it this way. The last thing I did when I was a foreign correspondent was be based in the stands, the bottom 8 republics in the former Soviet Union. And for the last few years, the biggest story there was the oil competition between the US and Russia. Who's going to control the oil on the Caspian Sea? That's a big geopolitics question. It was at the forefront of the tension between the United States and Russia. So that made it the very biggest of big geopolitics. When I came home, I was looking around for what was the next big thing I was going to write about? What was the next book I was going to write about? And I came upon EVs and batteries and how the US, this is going back to the Obama administration. We're talking like 2009, 2010. And they were back then talking about, we're going to get into EVs. It's the next big thing. We're going to own that space. And so I just, in the equation that I was writing about in the former Soviet Union, I substituted batteries for oil, batteries in geopolitics. And it was very early then, but now it's played out. And we see who is currently way ahead in that race.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, it's a major country in Asia. And I think in your book that you wrote, I think it's probably aged pretty well. I don't know how you feel about it at this point, but everyone is talking about various trade wars between the US and China. Most crucially, probably China producing lots of EVs. I think infamously, perhaps cheap, affordable EVs that threaten to undercut every European and American automaker in an existential way. And they're already selling tons of them in Mexico, Latin American countries, all of Asia, lots of Europe already. Can you help explain? I think in your book, you wrote a lot about this and you still write about this. The US has this history and this tradition of lots of innovation when it comes to the battery chemistries and the actual development of these technologies in the first place. Why is it that China is seemingly so far ahead now?
Yeah. The US has a history generally the last 4 decades or so of inventing something and then the manufacturing of it being done abroad. Someone else right? It was Japan, then it was South Korea, now it's China taking over that space. That's wearables, electronics of all kinds. And then it went on to solar panels, solar of all kinds. Now it's in the batteries and EV space. We somehow, it's a puzzle for me. I do ask a lot, why are Americans so risk taking and balls out when it comes to software, to things that are like an algorithm that you can turn around in 18 months. But when it comes to industrialization, building factories to make something, we've just lost our nerve. And that we used to have, and we just don't do it. We don't do it anymore. We're trying to get it back now. I do hear that, just as an aside, I do hear that younger people are more and more attracted going into these fields than it has been until recently. But we could do a lot better on that front.
Absolutely. I just spoke to a Clemson senior who had interned at Lucid, right? So there's still a pipeline going into the automotive industry or into these areas. I really like what you said about how there's so much focus in the US on our software and maybe to a degree silicon IP expertise, AI, chips, and doing all of this work. And vehicle manufacturers love to talk about it too. Tesla loves to talk about how it's at the forefront of self driving, or Lucid or Rivian, I'm sure, love to talk about their firmware and everything. But the battery story really plays out largely, I think, like a lot of the automotive industry in the Midwest, right? You have these initial developments happening in places like laboratories in Illinois. And of course, now work going on with GM pivoting on their Ultium cells, hopefully improving that situation, getting to scale. There's this whole US manufacturing story that, at least talking to Democrats, maybe this is partisan, has seemingly played out in the favor of the Biden administration towards a revitalization of manufacturing and industrial base in the US, of not just, oh, we're going to buy Chinese EVs because it's more environmentally sustainable, of more just saying, look, this is the inevitable evolution of the automotive industry and we're going to build it here. And Mary, Bara, you're leading all of that. What do you make of that story?
I think it is a smart thing to do. It's something that the Biden administration has pushed both in batteries and chips. What's the big picture? The big picture, it's not batteries necessarily. It's not chips. It's that it's a recognition that we really screwed up starting with NAFTA, really, of it was too simplistic of a philosophy that global trade would, opening up borders, would play well in every category. And it did play well in a lot of categories. For example, it pulled hundreds of millions of Chinese and people from Vietnam, Indonesia, and some other countries out of poverty. It did not play as well in the industrial heartland of the United States, where a lot of people, millions of people, fell out of the middle class. And I think this is an attempt to rectify that situation, to reinvigorate those places, bring back manufacturing, and you hope bring back higher paying jobs, right? $15, $20 an hour is not a well-paying job. That's not a middle-class job. These jobs have to be in the 30s and $40 an hour to allow those families to recover.
Yeah, there's this tension that comes from that. And I agree with that. And I think there are positive developments there. But I think we're in an election year, particularly what a lot of voters see is this trepidation, this tightrope walk of, okay, we're going to boldly push for EVs, which is what the last few Democratic administrations have really pushed. And we're going to do just relentlessly. In some cases, that means perhaps sourcing batteries from China, definitely sourcing a few battery minerals or components from China, and then potentially maybe giving Chinese automakers an entrance into the US. Because at the moment, Ford, GM, the US branch or parts of Stellantis, all of them in some ways are struggling globally. And they know that if China starts selling EVs in the US, like today, tomorrow, they wouldn't be competitive yet.
Yeah. So a couple of comments on that. One is that car makers, US car makers. And I think European also had this field of dreams idea. You declare we're going to EVs. That's the future. God ordained this. And now we need to put them out so that the people, the proletariat can partake of this manna. But that wasn't true, right? It's not an article of faith that the world has to go to EVs. Those EVs have to be desirable, right? For you, and it has to hit all of the marks, and you know what they are, and people know what they are. What is the thing that's going to make you fork over, name your price, but it's a high price for a car, and all the styling and all the gizmos, all those things that have to be right. And so that started out wrong, and the car makers are regrouping now for their
Yeah.
second run at this. As far as playing with China, makes the best batteries on the planet, the cheapest ones, and all the components that go into it. As the US and Europe too, as the West attempts to get into the game that China started and kept up at through the teens, and so that they are where they are until we're there, we are going to have to. It's not the Cold War, right? It's not ideological dogma. It's an economy. It's a business. We're going to have to accept Chinese batteries, Chinese components, critical minerals, and so on. We've got to learn how to make batteries. We have to create a skilled workforce, the know-how that we are innovating, not just in creating the batteries, but on the factory floor. How do we make the equally as good batteries as the Chinese do? And we are going to have to invite Chinese car makers into the US, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. And we should squeeze everything out of the Chinese that they squeezed out of us during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s.
Yeah, I want to hone in on what you said there too about the fact that at the moment I think no one would argue they're producing better, cheaper batteries than we are, and part of that maybe is a labor story and different subsidies that they have going on. Of course, everyone subsidizes their industries; they do so very aggressively. But I want to just emphasize the importance for listeners that batteries aren't a commodity at any point yet. Everyone talks about okay, they're getting cheaper, but battery for battery, it's not the same, right? An EV with a more sophisticated battery could have significantly better range and weigh less. It could charge much faster. All these characteristics that would be so desirable. Where at the moment, I think in the US, we and a lot of the world, maybe people have this presumption that EV technology is somewhat static or standing still, and it really isn't.
Yeah. So I just did this story on GM, which is really invested a lot of money since 2019 to get into batteries. It saw this as a differentiating advantage that it could have. And I was in the lab with one of the senior engineers, and I just asked, why are batteries so hard to make? And so he gave this example. So he immediately prior job was he worked for a plastics company, and they made membranes. They made plastic membranes. And he says, it's no big deal. It's the same thing that goes into plastic trash bags, except they are, instead of being a yard and a half long and 2 or 3 feet wide, they are thousands of square feet in area, and the thickness 1/100th the width of a human hair. So the tolerances, right? That's one. He said that's one example. There are 600 of these kinds of examples in a battery that you have to meet and not make any errors and no defects. And that's what the Chinese have mastered. That's why batteries are not a commodity. Why it's a skill. It's really a skill. and it takes time to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the hope, I'm sure, for GM with their Ultium cells and everyone is to do as much of that as possible in a proprietary way or in a way that's here and domestic at least. But at the moment, okay, we can lean on China. We can squeeze them the same way, maybe a parallel between Toyota imparting its manufacturing methods onto American automakers when they were struggling. But in some other ways, we have more closer ties to other geopolitical allies like South Korea who also seems to be doing some stuff with battery production. And of course, Japan also makes a lot of really tight tolerance electronic equipment. So, can you sum up between Japan and South Korea, who are much closer allies? Are there promising threads of cooperation there when it comes to batteries?
Oh, sure. They are our major geopolitical allies and economic allies. All of the car makers in the US, also Europe, are leaning on the South Koreans. Tesla tends to lean on Japan. They've been partners with Panasonic from the beginning. And next to China, the second CATL, the Chinese battery maker, LG, the South Korean battery maker, is the next best, and they're very good, right neck and neck. Um, where China and the Chinese battery makers have been able to do better is in two respects. One, there's scale. It's just a greater scale than the South Koreans in terms of volume, way bigger than the South Koreans. So they're able to produce those batteries cheaper. That's one thing. They've also been much more nervy about where they're willing to go when we hear about the sticking with the same chemistries, but making incremental advances in the engineering, in the way the battery packs are made, for example, of slipping and sticking with lithium ion, but a more nickel, less nickel, more manganese, more iron, not nickel, right? And these sorts of things that have driven up driving range, have driven down the price, have given us faster charging. All of those advances have happened in China, not in South Korea.
Hmm.
And I don't know why when I ask and say the South Korean companies, the big three, LG, Samsung, and SK, they're just conservative. And when they're pushed, like for example, this China's main EV batteries are using iron-based battery, LFP, and not the nickel-based one, NMC. And that's cheaper, fewer supply bottlenecks, just a smart thing to do. But when the Western car makers pushed the South Koreans, hey, can we get some LFP? We're good at the NMC. We don't want to do LFP. And now they're being dragged into it, but they're way behind and they're not going to be producing that chemistry at scale until the end of this decade.
Yeah, and case in point, Tesla just axed their cheapest car to this point, which was the standard range rear wheel drive Model 3. That had an LFP battery, I believe, from CATL. And that's the chemistry you mentioned. It's iron based. It doesn't require as much of the nickel, manganese, and cobalt. It's fundamentally very different. It's more durable. It has a lot of desirable qualities. In some other ways, I think you do have, like, I've been impressed when I was still covering the EV industry. Porsche was sourcing these incredible battery. I don't know what was the cell level or where, but their packs, for instance, in the Taycan, that vehicle could charge incredibly quickly, maybe the quickest I've seen of any Western vehicle. So at the very high end, obviously, that's not a commodity scalable vehicle, but it does seem okay. Some of the Western automakers do have access to some of this really state of the art tech, but it just hasn't really trickled down in any way.
Yeah, it has to start at the high end. A couple of thoughts on that. Those Porsches are very high nickel. That's one thing. And it's
Mm.
silicon in the anode, and silicon charges faster than pure graphite. And so that's something we're going to see. But one of the things that we've learned from the Chinese, so we're impressed with shiny objects. So whether it's an iPhone or whether it's our batteries or cars, what's the latest gizmo? What's the latest new camera I can have on my phone? And with batteries, it's been, okay, let's move to silicon. Let's move to lithium metal. Let's move to solid state. Why? Why, okay, now we're with lithium. What's the next thing? What? So what the Chinese have done is they focused on the good enough battery, not the shiny
Yeah.
object. And so this is an economic theory, right? This is Clay Christensen from Harvard pioneered this, that the technology that wins over decades through time is the good enough technology, not necessarily the very best, but the one that does pretty much what the consumer wants. And that's the one that ends up, right, and a little bit cheaper, and that's the one that ends up winning, and that's what's happened with batteries. And so,
Yeah.
like, we need to absorb that. It's okay to optimize what works right now.
Yeah, part of that might be driven. My observation by duty cycles in the US are very specific. People want really long ranges. They want really large vehicles. Sometimes they want ridiculous acceleration. Not to say that lots of Chinese vehicles can't do a lot of those similar things, but people want, you have GM putting a 240 kilowatt hour pack in some of their flagship vehicles. That is just outrageous. But it does, I don't know if it's profitable, probably not, but it is meeting demand for some people right now who want that duty cycle that's very unique to the US market. But let's shrink down. You mentioned this, right? You get the nickel, you have the cobalt, all these materials that some of which can be more or less problematic. That's what I see in the US, back to the political element, some consternation from some of the progressives who are most aggressive about EVs are now a little queasy about the fact that, yeah, they require lots of minerals. These batteries are thousands of pounds in some cases of what's called rare earth minerals. Can you speak to a little bit about the sourcing concerns? And the US, we seem to have a lot of resources, but China at the moment seems to have this death grip on like the supply for lots of this stuff.
So we are not going to end up because of, use a really crude term, NIMBYism. Everyone wants, not every, a lot of people want EVs. They don't want a nickel processing plant in their county. And but not only do they not want a nickel processing plant in their county, they'll cross the whole country to make sure that another state also doesn't have a nickel processing plant. It's almost a religion. So, I'm very pessimistic that we end up with the industrial base. But on a geopolitical level, we can do a US and friends approach to putting together our supply chain. And that that means that our companies sign up for nickel, cobalt, and manganese and lithium and so on in whatever country, lithium triangle and Nigeria and Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Indonesia and so on. And the stuff is processed there and then comes in. And maybe the components are made here. We can do it in a way that, for example, there's a lot of pushback on Indonesia because of its labor and environmental practices. And these are Chinese companies operating there that, that whose standards are a little bit different from the ones we expect here in the US. US companies can demand, and I know because I've been to Indonesia and asked the folks there who do not want to be another province of China, the government, right? And so they would like there to be geopolitical balance. They would like American and European companies to come in. They can come in and say, we will come in, we'll do our projects here, but the labor and environmental practices in our projects have to meet certain standards. That's the way I see this playing out. And it plays out, if it goes that way, it's advantages the US in this economic way. We put together this, let's say it's 20 countries, EV, US and allies supply chain, but that also adds up to a balancing effect in terms of the US China competition. They're not just economic partners, they're geopolitical partners.
I think a coalition approach probably is something that bipartisan groups could get behind, given that we've already seen aggressive Chinese tariffs happen under the Biden administration. And I don't think that would be any different under the Trump administration if they were to be reelected. You have consensus on that. We hinted a little earlier, Japan has a key role to play in battery supply. When it comes to the OEMs, the actual manufacturers of the assembled vehicle, Toyota, Honda, they've all been very conservative, downright pessimistic on EVs, while this China US war to develop the state of the art is playing out. What do you make of that?
I think they've been smart. Um, Circling back to what we discussed earlier, God did not ordain EVs, and they have to win their place in the market. They have to win over consumers, and a primary route to doing that is marching down the cost curve and learning how to make these in a way that a consumer goes into a showroom and is it just I just want to buy a new car, right? And all of these cars are there, and there's a combustion and a hybrid and a plug-in hybrid and an electric, and then just chooses, and it just happens that the car that the person chooses is the EV because that's what they wanted. I think that's the world that Toyota has seen and has predicted and kind of foresees down the road. And I also think that here in the US, people are very quick to attach politics to almost anything. And you don't want EVs already have this political flavor dimension to them, and that plays against them, right? And
Yeah.
so a product should just be a product, right? And not associated with one party or the
Well,
other. But if you're stuffing,
every engineer tells me that, but that's not the reality in the US. Of course, they don't want to be involved in politics, but that's why we're doing this is that inevitably it happens. I live in Colorado, and Colorado, despite being a pretty purple state, is very bullish on EVs from a state policy perspective. But then you have our neighbors up north. I was just in Wyoming, and that's a very different situation, right? I spoke with an F 150 Lightning owner at a charger, the one charger that was at this crucial bottleneck. They have a very different infrastructure situation. And he was saying he writes to state lawmakers every day, but he's just disappointed. He didn't seem to me to be a Democrat, but he just said because EVs have become Biden mobiles, the Wyoming state government wants nothing to do with it when it comes to allocating funds, for instance, for dispersing chargers, let alone mining permits or whatever else you might have. So I think you're right. You touched on it. The politics in the US are inescapable for EVs at the moment.
yeah. Well, the same thing happened with Obama and the Volt. Mitt Romney named the Volt, which was a plug-in hybrid, the
Mhm.
Obama mobile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's startling how prescient that was too, because now you talked about the Toyota showroom example, right? Consumers will come in, and I think hybrids have seen this at the moment. Amazing resurgence where people are like, plug-in hybrids. Oh, GM had the right idea in 2013, but just maybe a little bit too early. They didn't market it the right way. Now Toyota and maybe the South Koreans and some of the other OEMs are just cashing in, and then GM and Ford are now saying, "Oh, we're going to develop plug-in hybrids." And to me, as an outside observer, this is good job, guys. You're a decade late, but that's what they're doing. But to speak a little more positively to our American friends as we wrap up here, there are some exciting developments. You just talked about the story you published, I think today, with GM Energy, or sorry, with GM, their Ultium Cells division, and progress they've made on the automation and the manufacturing, which means they can pump out more vehicles and hopefully eventually do it profitably. Ford has a Skunk Works division going on at the moment to try to recapture some of that Tesla Model 3 magic and make a low cost, affordable EV at a time when Tesla seems to be abdicating from that market. So, can you touch on like any of those exciting developments in the US that are playing out, especially between Ford and GM?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are positive developments. So the dead wood has tended, as happens in industries, right? They tend to fail, and then the cream rises to the top. What we're seeing is the folks who make silicon anodes. So this is next gen batteries. They are going to make it. They are making it. That's technology is here. We
Mm.
are going to start seeing, really starting next year, as an option, offered as an option, and then as the decade unfolds, being introduced into mainstream and standard. That's a big deal, right? That means fast charging, and that means greater driving range. And we do see that we had thought that the startups were the leading edge. They were the ones to watch. It's turned out that the old guard are the ones to watch. And you just named it. So Jim Farley, who the CEO of Ford, established secretly the Skunk Works out in Irvine, California. Now he's shifting it over to Long Beach. He's got 300 former Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, Apple people. Basically, everyone in there are from these blue chip tech companies. And he doesn't go there. He claims that his key fob doesn't work on the building and just said, okay, in 2027, I want EVs that people will buy, right? And that's what they're doing. And then GM, this story that I did was them basically saying, okay, in 2019, we proclaimed Ultium. That was our battery. That was the be all end all. We've actually discovered that the Ultium is okay, but we need to do a lot better than that. We need more than that too. And so they have brought in, they hired 2 former Tesla people to run their manufacturing, to run their battery side, and they're getting their act together too. So I expect a lot out of those 2 companies, out of the silicon players in Europe. BMW and Mercedes are really doing well, and Toyota. Let's not count out Toyota. As much grief as they got for being slow to the game, I think that when they do, and we're going to see this in the second half of the decade, when they do come in, I think people are going to be pleasantly surprised with what the product is and the price those models are sold for.
Yeah, you have to remember that is the company that mainstreamed hybrids. With the Prius wasn't, funnily enough, actually the first hybrid, but it was really the first relevant one for the US market. And they upstaged Honda there. So that's super exciting. At the moment, Honda is relying on GM to sell rebadged GM vehicles as Honda EVs. But Toyota always says we're waiting for solid state or we're waiting for some kind of battery development. And is watching the space. They've said it for 10 years. So I'll believe it when I see it with them. But I think it'd be foolish to count them out because they are still, right, the world's, I think, largest automaker. At this point, maybe the world's largest non-Chinese automaker. They absolutely could have a huge role in this. And it's funny to me, Lucid, Rivian, Tesla, these companies all developed tight relationships with companies like Panasonic to source cells. Some of them, all of them, I think at this point, make their own motors. They really innovated a lot at this foundational level. Now, like you said, the old people in Detroit are doing that and getting around to it. And maybe they will leapfrog the newer players too, because they could have a huge scale advantage. So that's all exciting stuff. But if people want to read more about the cutting edge, learn about it before anyone else, they can do that right at The Electric. They can subscribe.
They should. Everyone should. All of your listeners should.
Yeah, if this interested you and you're able to subscribe to The Electric under the information you write, break a lot of news there. You cause a lot of consternation for many of the Tesla fans on Twitter who I happen to interact with.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, a lot of them think you're spreading fake news of Tesla ditching the cheap EV and all that. So I guess that's the tension of journalism and politics too. Sometimes you break news that people don't want to hear, and
that's crazy. We're going to find out. We're going to find out soon enough. But they don't want to believe what happened, but it did. It happened.
Yeah, maybe history will get rewritten. We'll see what happens. Yeah. Tesla is doing something with self-driving at the moment. But thank you, Steve, so much for coming on and joining me for this. Hopefully this has been really helpful for listeners. And again, you can subscribe to The Electric to read more of Steve's work. Thank you so much for listening to This Week in Directly Current. And thank you again to Steve for his time. A few updates since we recorded. Tesla's Robotaxi event happened on the Thursday before this episode released, and it didn't really give us anything concretely new, let alone the cheaper drivable EV that Steve reported they were no longer making in favor of doing a 2-door self-driving taxi, which is exactly what they announced alongside some other concepts. Also, General Motors, as reported by Steve and now referenced elsewhere, is no longer calling its battery strategy for its cars Ultium. Instead, GM is pursuing a more diverse set of battery chemistry and suppliers, and we'll just call it a rebrand at the moment. There's no shortage of news in the EV industry, and we're here to keep you up to date with whatever intersects with politics and the American election. Stay tuned next week for a very, very exciting guest from government to speak with us. Until then, learn all about the work we're doing at evpolitics.org and subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already in your app of choice. I'm Max Patton, and I'll see you next time on Directly Current.